Hi students, welcome back to the Chapter 9 lecture on the muscular system. This is part 2. So we left off last time learning about the 3 different types of muscle and the structure, function, and location of those different types of muscles. And then we started looking at some of the terminology that we use with skeletal muscle and how skeletal muscles are named. So now the remainder of this lecture is going to be focused just on skeletal muscle. And one of the things that I want to begin to explain to you now is the anatomy of skeletal muscle. How is skeletal muscle put together? Both the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle, but also the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle. So we'll start with the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle first. So if we're looking at individual skeletal muscles as organs, what you'll find is that they all have slightly different shapes. And so we can categorize those shapes of muscles into a few different categories based on what we call their fiber arrangement. Now remember from the, we haven't talked about this, a muscle fiber is also the same thing as a muscle cell. So please ensure that you know that muscle fibers are the same things as muscle cells. And the way in which muscle fibers come together is different depending on the function of the muscle. Now, all muscles have some pretty general functions. They contract. Skeletal muscle helps to maintain body posture and position. It helps to maintain body temperature, helps to produce movement, etc. But the way in which they do or they carry out their actions is going to vary depending on what the action is or the movement is. So we see a variation in the structure of muscles because they function a little bit differently in how they carry out their actions. So the first picture that you see here on the left is what we call a parallel muscle fiber arrangement. And what you see are, there would be a tendon going off in this direction, and you can partially see the white tendon here. And everything that you see in between these these red lines going this direction are bundles of muscle fibers, bundles of muscle cells. And we call this a parallel muscle fiber arrangement because the collagen fibers of the tendon would run in the same direction. And so these parallel muscle organizations allow for the greatest amount of contraction. Usually we get about 30% of a shortening of the muscle. So this type of muscle fiber arrangement creates the greatest range of motion. The biceps brachii is a really good example. So when this muscle contracts, it's going to get fatter here in the middle of the muscle, and the whole muscle gets fatter towards the center. That's called the belly of the muscle, or the gaster. Gaster also means belly. So this type of muscle fiber arrangement allows for the greatest range of motion. If we look over to the right, we find what's called a convergent muscle fiber arrangement, where you have a tendon here, and then you would have an aponeurosis here, so a big broad tendon. And the muscle fibers, they're converging on the tendon from slightly different directions. So there you see the tendons coming in at an angle, the muscle fibers coming in at an angle. Here you see the muscle fibers converging on the tendon more or less parallelly. And then down here again, you see those fibers converging on that tendon again from an angle. So this type of muscle fiber arrangement doesn't allow for a great range of movement, but it allows for diversity of movement. So when these fibers contract, so we can have different parts of the muscle can create pull in different directions. So for instance, when these fibers up here contract, this part of the muscle gets shorter and lifts the rest of the muscle up. If you've ever seen somebody have the ability to wiggle their pectoralis muscles, you've seen how this works. You can also then have movement in this direction towards the tendon, or movement at an angle in this direction, and that would pull the whole muscle down. So that's where you kind of get the jiggling of the pectoralis muscles. You can employ different parts of the muscle to contract independently of the other parts of the muscle. So not a huge range of motion, but you have diversity of motion there. And then if we move to this picture, you see in white, here's the tendon, and then you see the muscle fibers. I'll just draw them in black. They converge on the tendon independently and at slightly separate angles. And this is called a pennate, a unipennate. Pennate means feather. So this is the one feather arrangement. And each one of these muscle fibers has a different connection to the tendon. And this type of muscle fiber arrangement creates the greatest tension. Not necessarily the strongest, but the greatest tension for the muscle size, because each one of those muscle fibers pulls on the tendon, and so the tension that's created by each muscle fiber is cumulative. So this is totally made up, but I'm just putting it in numbers for you. If this muscle fiber here produces a tension of 1, and so does this next one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and let's say we had 10 muscle fibers all producing a tension of 1, if we add up the tension that is created on this tendon by all 10 muscle fibers, you'd have a tension of 10. So that's all that allows for. That unipennate muscle fiber arrangement allows for smaller muscles to create a whole lot of tension, even though the muscles are small themselves. The same is true for the next muscle fiber arrangement, bipennate. This just means 2 feathers. So you would have a centralized point of attachment here, and then you'd have another tendon. So each one of these bundles of muscle fibers all converge independently and attach independently. So this makes a really strong muscle. You don't necessarily get a huge range of motion or get diversity of motion, but you get increased tension. So if you look over here, this muscle right here is called the rectus femoris muscle. That is one of the larger muscles of the quadriceps group. That produces a large amount of tension on the knee joint. And then lastly, or there are 2 more, we've got multipennate, where you have multiple tendons and you've got fibers converging from multiple directions. And again, same idea here, able to create a lot of tension in this fiber arrangement. And the deltoid muscle is an example of that. And then finally, you have what's called a circular muscle fiber arrangement. So imagine muscle cells or muscle fibers arranged in a circular pattern. And this arrangement allows for us to have these circular muscles that control openings in the body. So when those muscle fibers contract, the opening to the body gets smaller. When those muscle fibers relax, the openings to the body get wider. So one example here would be a muscle called orbicularis oris, where that's the circular muscle around the mouth. That's literally what that translates. Circle mouth. That's what that translates to. So this is how you see muscle fibers arranged to create the different shapes of muscles. And the different shapes of muscles allow those muscles to carry out different actions, different movements. Now what I want to move on to is the anatomy of a skeletal muscle. We're not talking about the shape, but how are muscles put together? How are they arranged? And we're going to go through almost all of the hierarchies of organization. So I'm going to add a slide here. And back to this picture right here, when you first look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, all I see are cylinders inside of cylinders inside of cylinders inside of cylinders. And that's totally true. That's exactly how these muscles as organs are put together. And it can be a little bit confusing to, when you're looking at a picture, to understand which level of organization are you looking at. And so we're going to go through this step by step and see how these muscles are put together. And then when we come back to this picture, it'll make a little bit more sense. But we're going to start at let's recall our levels of organization. Remember that atoms come together to make molecules. Molecules come together to make organelles. Organelles come together inside of living cells to create all the components of a living cell. Cells come together to make tissues. Oops, but not a space. Tissues come together to make organs. Organs come together to make organ systems. And then, of course, you have the whole organism. We're going to go through almost all of these levels of organization. We're going to start at the molecular level of organization, look at some of the organelles that are made by those molecules to create these specialized organelles in cells. We're going to look at muscle cells, we've already looked at muscle tissue, right, underneath the microscope in part 1, and we'll move all the way up then to how muscle tissue comes together to make the organ that we know as a muscle. And all of this is obviously part of the muscular system. Okay, so this is the route that we're going to take. And if we go to molecular level. So inside of a muscle cell, there are 2 types of proteins that are going to interact with one another and cause contraction of the muscle. Now, I say there are 2 types of proteins. There obviously are plenty of proteins. We're only going to talk about the 2 main types of proteins involved in muscle contraction. These proteins are what we call myofilaments. 2 types. One are what we call the thick filaments. The thick filaments are made of a protein called myosin. And one individual myosin molecule looks like this. It kind of looks like a caveman's club, where you have a head and a tail. And those individual myosin myofilaments come together in these thick collections of many myofilaments. And so you see that there are many myofilaments here, right? Many myosin myofilaments here. So this is one of the reasons why we call them thick filaments, because they're thicker than the next filament we're going to look at, the next protein we're going to look at. The second type of protein, main type of protein involved in muscle contraction, is what we call an actin myofilament. The protein is called actin. So these actin molecules have a different shape than myosin molecules. And the actin molecules, the actin proteins, actually have 2 components, but you don't need to know what those components are. But they're represented in this picture as these strings of pink pearls. So there's one actin component, and then here is the other. And they string together and kind of twist around to create a whole molecule of actin, or what we would call a thin filament. For now, don't worry about these other proteins. You'll learn about these proteins in physio. Don't worry about titin. Don't worry about troponin. Don't worry about tropomyosin. Those are important proteins in muscle contraction, but we're not learning about muscle contraction entirely here. We're just looking at the structure of muscle. So these actin and myosin myofilaments come together to make a larger structure that we call a sarcomere. And a sarcomere is what we refer to as the individual unit of contraction. And what that means is this is the smallest structure inside of a muscle cell that actually has the ability to get shorter or to contract. And it's because of the arrangement of the myosin and actin myofilaments. It's a direct result of the structure of this sarcomere. So a sarcomere is marked by some landmarks here. You have at one end of a sarcomere, there's what we call a Z line, that zigzag line. And on the other end of the sarcomere, there's another Z line. And in the middle, there is another protein here that acts as an anchorage protein called that middle line is called the M line. And then what you see here are alternating thick and thin filaments, alternating actin myofilaments and myosin myofilaments. In pink, those are the actin myofilaments, and in blue are the myosin myofilaments. So you get this alternation of actin, myosin, as we go from the top to the bottom of the sarcomere. So we've got actin, myosin, actin, myosin, actin, myosin, actin, myosin, and so on. So these actin and myosin myofilaments come together in a very precise way to make something larger called the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the individual unit of contraction, the smallest structure inside of a muscle cell that can contract. We're still at the molecular level. We are not even at the organelle level of organization yet. So let's go and move up to the next level of organization. And this is what's called a myofibril. A myofibril is an organelle inside of a muscle cell, a very highly specialized organelle inside of a muscle cell that's made of many sarcomeres lined up end to end. So your authors here are hiding it a little bit, but let me see if I can show it to you. So here's the M line there in blue, this line right here. And then if we had to draw in the Z lines, we could draw in a Z line here, and then a Z line over here, and you'd see that that would make one sarcomere. And then down here, right next to it would be another sarcomere, and down here would be another sarcomere. So they kind of get organized end to end to end to end. So many sarcomeres come together to make what we call a myofibril. And that myofibril is an organelle inside of a muscle cell. Now what you see here in blue is a structure called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It kind of sounds like an organelle that you're already familiar with called the endoplasmic reticulum. Sarco actually means, I think it's Greek, sarco is muscle. So this is a really highly specialized endoplasmic reticulum that we find inside of muscle cells. And its function is to store calcium ions. So inside of this blue structure that you see, imagine millions upon millions upon millions of calcium ions. Calcium ions are vital for muscle contraction. Without enough calcium ions, muscle contraction cannot occur. The other thing that you see here is what we call the transverse tubules, or T-tubules. If you've had physiology, you know about transverse tubules and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Like I said, we are not going to go into the details of muscle contraction. You'll get that in your human phys class. But in order for me to explain to you what transverse tubules do, you kind of need to know how muscles contract. But I'm not going to hold you responsible for every single detail. So let's say that this circular structure here, underneath the blue net, is a myofibril. The blue net is the sarcoplasmic reticulum that's holding on to calcium ions. what you see here, that pink sheath, is called the sarcolemma. That's the plasma membrane of a muscle cell, the cell membrane. So that's the outside of a muscle cell. In part 1 of the lecture, I mentioned that most skeletal muscle requires some sort of stimulation to contract. Usually it's nervous system stimulation. A nerve cell has to tell the muscle cell to contract. And the only way that a nerve cell can tell a muscle to contract is by sending an electrical signal to the muscle cell. And that electrical signal is called an action potential. And just for ease of understanding, think of that action potential as a bolt of lightning. It's not, obviously, it's a very complex chemical reaction that occurs. But let's imagine for just a minute that there was a nerve cell right here. And this is what a nerve cell looks like, right? It's got these long extensions. And let's just imagine that action potential comes down the nerve cell and it makes its way out of the cell itself. And that action potential, that little bolt of lightning, makes its way to the cell membrane. And that bolt of lightning, that action potential, is going to travel down the length of the cell membrane until it gets to these T-tubules, these little pores in the cell membrane. And I got to change colors because you can't see this. So here's that action potential traveling down the length of the cell membrane, and that action potential is going to dip down these transverse tubules. So that electrical signal makes its way deep inside the muscle cell. Remember that the sarcomeres are the individual units of contraction. They're the structures that are going to get shorter and cause the entire muscle cell to get shorter. So you gotta tell those sarcomeres to get shorter. You gotta initiate that process. So that electrical signal, in order to stimulate those sarcomeres, has to get deep inside the muscle cell some way. And it does that through the transverse tubules. Okay? All right, so far we've learned that actin and myosin myofilaments come together to make a sarcomere. Many sarcomeres come together to make a myofibril. And now what we see is there will be thousands of myofibrils inside of a muscle cell. So each one of these little red dots that you see here inside of this muscle cell is a myofibril, thousands of them. And each myofibril is made up of thousands of sarcomeres. So you've got thousands of contractile structures inside of this muscle fiber or a muscle cell. As I mentioned before, the cell membrane of a muscle cell is called the sarcolemma. That just means muscle sheath. And then surrounding the entire muscle cell is going to be a layer of loose connective tissue that we call endomysium. So this right here, this kind of cross-hatched layer, is the endomysium. So that's going to be a layer of areolar connective tissue that surrounds individual muscle cells. Another term that we should be familiar with is all of the contents inside of a muscle cell. That includes nuclei, mitochondria, myofibrils, the cytosol. All of that is referred to as the sarcoplasm. You've probably heard the term cytoplasm before. Cytoplasm would be just a generic term for all the contents inside of a cell. Sarcoplasm refers to all of the contents inside of a muscle cell. Okay, so that's where we are in the levels of organization. We are now at the cellular level of organization. But that's just one individual skeletal muscle cell. So many skeletal muscle cells come together to create what we call a fascicle. So we're already here at letter B. If you want to look at this picture, the way that you go from the smallest level of organization to the largest level of organization is bottom to top. letter E to A. So we've already gone through E, D, and C. So here we go. We've got individual muscle cells or muscle fibers coming together to make a larger structure called a fascicle. And that fascicle is going to be surrounded by a layer of areolar connective tissue. Let's not just call that loose connective tissue. Let's call it areolar. A layer of areolar connective tissue called perimysium. And that's what you see here in purple. And that perimysium helps to separate fascicles from one another, but also allows for anchorage of blood vessels, like you see here in blue and red, and anchorage of nerves. Remember, nerves have to be anchored to the muscle in order to tell the muscle fibers to contract, right? So that perimysium has a couple of different functions. And then many fascicles come together to create what we know as the skeletal muscle, the organs of the muscular system. So here's a fascicle, here's another fascicle, and here's another, and here's another. So if we want to kind of just look at our levels of organization here, we've got cell, tissue, organ. And then, of course, down here we've got sarcomeres made of molecules, and the myofibril being an organelle. Okay, so that's the anatomy. This is how skeletal muscles are put together. This is the structure of skeletal muscles. Now, this is really basic. There are more details. We are not going over the process of muscle contraction. Like I said, you'll go over that in great detail when you get to your physiology course, or if you've already had phys, you already know how this process works. So we're going to switch gears again. We've just learned how these muscles are put together right here, right? And we know that tendons, which are these white structures, anchor muscle to bone. But where do those tendons come from? What are they made of? Well, we know they're made of collagen fibers, right? But it's not like the collagen fibers just begin here and they end right here. The collagen fibers of the tendon are made up of the endomysium, the perimysium, and epimysium. That epimysium is the layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds an entire muscle. So if the muscle cells end right there, I'll use yellow, the endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium continue on. Even when the muscle cell itself stops, that connective tissue continues on, and those fibers then weave together to create the tendon. And of course, they continue all the way down here, right? So you don't have muscle cells in the tendon, just collagen fibers making up the tendon. And then remember what surrounds all bone. Remember, all bone is surrounded by periosteum, and periosteum has an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer. So these fibers of the tendon weave right into the outer fibrous layer of the periosteum on bone, making that a really tight connection. In the next picture, we can see this a little bit better. So you see, here's one individual muscle fiber, and you can see the white, oh, here we go, this is better. You can see the white endomysium around it, this little transparent layer that you see here, and that would be here, right? And then you see many muscle fibers coming together to make a fascicle, and then many fascicles coming together to make that muscle, the organ itself. And what's surrounding the fascicles in white here, that's perimysium. And then what is surrounding the entire muscle itself is epimysium. And that epimysium weaves into the deep fascia. So you got perimysium and endomysium. So you got endomysium, perimysium, epimysium, all continuing on once the muscles terminate. And then those fibers, those connective tissue fibers, weave right into the periosteum of bone. Okay. So now that we know how skeletal muscle is put together, its structure, its anatomy, I'm only going to mention just very briefly how muscles contract. It's important. It's something that you should just have a general idea of how it occurs. But again, you're not going to be responsible for every single detail. And I'm not going to mention every single detail. But there's some important things that you should know here. So here's a skeletal muscle cell or muscle fiber. One of the things that you can see here are the peripheral nuclei. That's what these little bumps are. You can see the myofibrils. And this would be one fascicle. Here's another fascicle. Oh, sorry, not a fascicle. What am I talking about? These are clusters of myofibrils. And up on top, you can see what we call a motor neuron. This is just a specialized name for a nerve cell that creates movement. So when this motor neuron sends out its action potential or its electrical signal, that electrical signal travels down this structure right here called the axon, and that electrical signal travels out these little branches here, and eventually that electrical signal reaches the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. And then what happens, I'm just going to use green, but what happens is that electrical signal travels down the length of the muscle, causing the muscle to get shorter. So then that's essentially that muscle fiber, that muscle cell is going to contract. It's going to get shorter. And if all of the muscle cells in a fascicle get shorter, the entire fascicle gets shorter. If all of the fascicles in a muscle as an organ get shorter, the entire muscle shortens. And when that entire muscle shortens, the muscle pulls on a bone to create either tension or movement. So that's just the real basics of how muscles contract. The point where a nerve cell meets a muscle cell has a specialized name. This is where communication occurs between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. The name is called a neuromuscular junction. It just means the nerve-muscle point of communication. We're going to come back to this when we start learning about nervous tissue. I'll revisit some of these terms. Okay? So that was the anatomy of a skeletal muscle. We started from the molecular level and built a skeletal muscle from the bottom up. Now what we're going to do is talk about a few different pieces of information about skeletal muscle, and then we'll learn about the different types of skeletal muscle fibers, the different types of skeletal muscle cells. So first let's talk about muscle tone. And muscle tone is kind of a phrase that gets thrown around quite a bit, and unless you've had anatomy and physiology or some sort of exercise science course, you might not really know what muscle tone means. So some parts, we're not going to cover motor units in lecture, but you can still do the homework question on motor units. Some of the parts of muscles contract continuously. And so unless you're sleeping, parts of your individual muscles are continuously contracting. Not all parts, not every single fascicle is contracting at all times.
So it's almost like the fascicles take turns contracting, where one fascicle will contract and then it gets tired and then another fascicle takes over. And so this produces a continuous resting tension, not contraction, but a tension on the bone that the muscle is attached to. And this is what we call muscle tone. So if somebody has is very toned, for instance, or they have good muscle tone, even when they're sitting down or just not even using a muscle, you can see those muscles beneath the skin. And the reason for that is some parts of that muscle, even though the person isn't actively contracting that muscle, some parts of that muscle are still contracted. And so that creates resting tension on these bones. That resting tension or that resting muscle tone helps to stabilize bones and joints. So individuals with greater muscle tone tend to have stronger joints and tend to get injured less. Say, for instance, you're playing a sport, or you're looking at two different people playing a sport, one who has very good muscle tone and one who has very little muscle tone. If it's a contact sport, for instance, and some contact occurs between two individuals, or one of the individuals falls, there's going to be some impact on those joints. The person with more muscle tone is going to have more stable joints and therefore are less likely to get injured in that process, versus somebody who has less muscle tone. Well, they don't have as much stability in their joints and they're more likely to suffer from an injury. Okay, so let's talk about how muscles grow and shrink. Muscle growth is called hypertrophy, and when muscles get smaller, it's called atrophy. And so it's common it's common to hear that in order to make muscles larger, you have to rip and tear or damage muscles, and that's not necessarily true. If you think about it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to damage your muscles. Skeletal muscle cells don't undergo mitosis readily. It's not like they're actively growing and dividing to get bigger. Skeletal muscle cells don't really do that. But what you can do is you can make let me rephrase that. Skeletal muscles don't grow and divide to make more of themselves, and that's not how a muscle gets bigger. The way a muscle gets bigger is each one of the cells that make up the muscle gets bigger. You stuff more things inside of each cell. The cell expands, and if all the cells in a fascicle expand, the fascicle expands, and if all of the fascicles in a muscle expand, the entire muscle expands or gets bigger. So you increase muscle size via exercise. So when you place demand on a muscle through exercise, the muscle goes, oh shoot, I need some more energy. How am I going to get more energy? Oh yeah, my energy building machines are the mitochondria. So when you place demand on a muscle, the muscle goes, okay, I'm going to need some more mitochondria. The muscle also realizes, well, in order to make more ATP, because you're putting more demand on me, I need more fuel for the mitochondria. Why can't I erase that? So the muscle cell increases your glycogen reserves. Glycogen is stored glucose. So glycogen or glucose is going to go into the mitochondria. And what comes out of the mitochondria is ATP, energy for cells to use for contraction. In order to get in order for the mitochondria to utilize glucose, you need to have enzymes to initiate the process. So these cells start to also accumulate what we call glycolytic enzymes, enzymes that initiate this process. And let me just write out the process for you again. This is just in general, right? Remember we were talking about skeletal muscles and how they generate heat in the process, or heat is a byproduct of producing ATP. So here's glucose, right? C6H12O6 in the presence of oxygen, and inside of the cell and inside of the mitochondria, glucose gets converted to ATP. That's what you need if you're exercising, right? You need ATP for muscle contraction to occur. What you also get is some CO2. That's what you breathe out when you're exercising. You also release some water during that chemical reaction. And also, of course, like we mentioned before, heat. This is why you get hot after you started exercising, because your body has just ramped up this process of cellular respiration in your muscle cells. In order, the goal here is to make ATP for muscle contraction to occur. CO2, water, and heat are just byproducts of getting ATP out of that glucose molecule. Glycogen is essentially glucose. It's stored glucose. So your body, your muscle cells start storing any excess glucose in your diet as glycogen in your muscle cells, because the muscle cells are like, well, shoot, this person is putting consistent demand on me to contract. I better save some of that glucose. So we save glucose in the form of glycogen, but in order to get this process started, this process right here, in order to get that started, we need enzymes. So your muscle cells also start storing those glycolytic enzymes. Most of this process right here, this chemical reaction, occurs in mitochondria. So if you're placing more demand on muscle cells, you're going to need more mitochondria to convert more of that energy per unit time into ATP in order for contraction to occur. So all of those things, the mitochondria, the glycolytic enzymes, and the glycogen accumulate inside your muscle cells. Your muscle cells get bigger. And you also increase the number of myofibrils. Remember those organelles that are made of sarcomeres? Those are the structures that are actually contracting. So when you place demand on your muscles, you're also increasing the number, you're telling your muscles to increase the number of contractile structures, the myofibrils. And so you increase the number of myofibrils, the glycogen reserves, the glycolytic enzymes, and the mitochondria, and what you see is muscle hypertrophy, or growth of a muscle. When you don't exercise, or you've been exercising really hard for a long time and then get injured and stop, or just naturally, as we age, muscles start to get smaller, and this is called atrophy. Or this could happen if somebody who is paralyzed, or you break a bone and you have a cast on a limb for some period of time and you're not using those muscles. Your muscles go, wait a second, it's costing me a lot of time and energy to maintain the mitochondria, to keep these glycolytic enzymes inside these cells, and to maintain these glycogen reserves, and to maintain these myofibrils. If I'm not going to use the muscle, why keep all of these things? I can use this energy and these components elsewhere. So what happens is those things that would normally be accumulating in a muscle that's or maintained in a muscle that's large, they start to disappear. And this is what we call atrophy. And as a result, we see muscles get smaller. Okay, so we've just learned that how muscles get larger and how they get smaller. Now let's learn about the different types of skeletal muscle cells or skeletal muscle fibers. There are slightly different types for slightly different things, right? Slightly different structures, slightly different functions, even at the cellular level. When you get to physiology, you learn more about this. But first up, there are fast fibers, or also what we call white fibers. White muscle fibers are larger in diameter than red muscle fibers because they're have very densely packed myofibrils, so a lot of contractile structures. So this makes these muscles really thick. They have large glycogen reserves, so you've got near immediate amounts of glucose on hand, but they only have a few mitochondria. So they've got plenty of energy built up, but they don't have a whole lot of mitochondria to constantly burn that energy. The mitochondria in fast fibers can't keep up with long-term energy demand. So even though there are large amounts of glycogen in the cells themselves, the mitochondria can only create ATP so fast. So what happens with fast muscle fibers is they fatigue very quickly. They get tired quickly. But the advantage here is because they have so many myofibrils, so many contractile structures, that when these cells do contract, they contract very quickly and very forcefully. And so they actually are able to contract in about 0.01 seconds or less following that signal coming from the nerve cell. The way I think of fast fibers or white muscle fibers is like the white meat on your turkey or your chicken, or even if you're eating a fish that has, before you cook it, has very light or white colored flesh. So let me give you an example here. If you think about turkey or chickens, doesn't matter. Where do you find the white meat on a turkey or a chicken? The majority of it you find in the breast, right? So the majority of the fast muscle fibers in a turkey or chicken are found in the breasts. These birds no longer have the ability to fly. So the breast, the pectoral muscles of these chickens and turkeys are not meant for flying. They're not meant for endurance activities. What these chickens and turkeys use the breast muscle for is flapping their wings to jump out of the way of predators. They cannot fly. So they make these really forceful contractions of the pectoralis muscles simply to jump out of the way. But not that you've ever done this, but if you were to chase a chicken or a turkey around a farmyard long enough, they're going to they'll start trying to jump out of your way, trying to jump into trees or jump onto any structure to get away from you. But if you chase them long enough, they're going to fatigue and they're not going to be able to jump any longer. What they will do then is they will try and just run away from you. And where do you find the dark meat on a chicken or a turkey? You find it in the legs. The parts of these birds that are meant for endurance activities. So the muscles that you find there in the legs are what we call slow muscle fibers or red muscle fibers. So this is why the meat looks dark, because of the fibers actually appear a little bit darker. So these red muscle fibers, these are the endurance fibers. They're not nearly as strong as the white muscle fibers because they don't have as many myofibrils. So they're not as big, they're not as bulky as white muscle fibers. They're about half the diameter of those white or those fast muscle fibers. So they're much thinner. They take about 3 times as long to contract after stimulation, but still that's pretty quick, 0.03 seconds after the nerve cell tells them to contract. But the thing is, they contain abundant mitochondria. So as long as there is enough oxygen and glucose or glycogen available, that oxygen and glucose can continue to be sent into the mitochondria for cellular respiration, and out the other end becomes ATP, a pretty consistent source of ATP. So those muscles can continue to use that ATP to contract over and over and over again. You can ignore this using aerobic metabolism. We're not going to talk about that. And these red muscle fibers are very well vascularized. They have a really extensive network of capillaries. So this is where they get the constant supply of glucose and oxygen for contraction. So they have more capillaries than these fast muscle fibers. The extensive vascularization makes these fibers appear more red in color. But in addition to that, these cells contain a red pigment called myoglobin. This is an oxygen carrying molecule, an oxygen storage molecule. So really, inside of the red muscle fibers is myoglobin, which is hanging on to oxygen. So there's a nice oxygen storehouse inside the cell itself. And so that red pigment gives these red muscle fibers their reddish color, at least in a living organism. When the organism is dead, that reddish color turns dark. And so that's what you see as the dark meat on a chicken or a turkey. But these red muscle fibers are these endurance fibers that don't fatigue as quickly as the fast muscle fibers, so they can continue to contract over longer periods of time. But they aren't as strong or as forceful as the white muscle fibers. So I'll give you one last analogy. Think of an endurance runner versus a weightlifter. An endurance runner, a long distance runner, is more likely to be lean and have a lot of lean muscle or a lot of red muscle fibers, and hence why they're good at endurance activities. And probably not very strong as far as weightlifting activities. A competitive weightlifter is going to have much bulkier muscles because they're going to have more white muscle fibers and can lift large amounts of weight, but not for very long periods of time because those white muscle fibers are going to fatigue quite quickly. So the weightlifter isn't going to be nearly as good at the endurance activity. So that's two types of skeletal muscle fibers, white and red. You can also call them fast and slow. There's an intermediate type as well that we call pink, but you can learn about that in physiology. We won't go over that here. As far as how muscles develop, fetal development, you know that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. They have, when they're in their adult form or fully differentiated, where's that term? When they're fully differentiated in their adult form, they have many nuclei that you can see right here, right? All of these are nuclei. But they don't start out that way. They start out as immature muscle cells here and here, and those immature muscle cells are called myoblasts. You've seen that suffix before. Blast means immature. Those myoblasts eventually fuse together to create the fully differentiated cell that's multinucleated, that we know as a skeletal muscle cell. And then last, a couple of comments on what happens to our muscles as we age. Our skeletal muscles become smaller in diameter because they're beginning to atrophy, like we discussed earlier. They also become less elastic. Not only can muscle cells contract, get shorter, they can also kind of be pulled apart, or kind of like pulled apart like a rubber band, and then they'll go back to their original resting shape. We lose a little bit of that elasticity as we age, so hence why older individuals often complain that they're more stiff. That stiffness occurs because of loss of elasticity in the muscle, but also stiffness in the joints as a result of that synovial fluid being more viscous. Our tolerance for exercise decreases for a number of reasons, and then our ability to recover from muscular injuries decreases. So we don't heal as well as we once did, and we don't heal as fast as we once did. I'm sure your book has a little section at the end of the chapter that goes into more detail about aging and the muscular system. So that's all I have for Chapter 9. Next up will be your Introduction to the Nervous System, Chapter 13.